Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Stephen Hayward, and I'm a technical specialist with the Invasive Species Council of British Columbia. ISCBC is a collaborative-based organization committed to reducing the spread and impacts of non-native species within BC. I'm joining you today from Nanaimo, where I'm grateful to live and work on the unceded traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, co-hosted by the Integrated Vegetation Management Association of British Columbia and the ISCBC, entitled Canadian Pesticide Registration from Lab to Label. This webinar is approved in BC for one continuing education credit towards pesticide applicator certification. To qualify for the credit, you must participate in the entire webinar, including the quiz at the end. The quiz link will be added in the chat box immediately following Danielle's webinar. And if you're based from Alberta, they will ask for your birth date at the start. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for purchase on the ISCBC's Learning Center later this month. ISCBC and IVMA members will have free access to the recording, and everyone will have the opportunity to earn CEC credits if they watch the entire recording and complete the quiz. See the link to ISCBC's Learning Center in the chat box. If you have questions about the credits, please reach out to our following speaker, Gwen Shrimpton at IVMA. I'm sure you're all Zoom experts by now, but if you experience any technical problems with Zoom, please hit the chat box and Fiona will see if she can assist you. Also, everyone has been muted, so you should be only able to hear myself and the other presenters. In Zoom, you have the option to select speaker view or gallery view at the top of your screen. We recommend speaker view. If you have any questions during Danielle's presentation, please type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Danielle will be taking time at the end of the presentation to answer questions, time permitting. If you see your preferred question already in the Q&A box, you can click the thumbs up button to upvote the question and bump it up the list. If we run out of time to address all of the questions, we'll share the questions and answers via email later. At this point, I am pleased to give a warm welcome and introduction to Gwen Shrimpton, Executive Director of the Integrated Vegetation Management Association. Over to you, Gwen.
Thank you, Steve. So as Steve mentioned, this webinar is co-hosted by the Integrated Vegetation Management Association of BC and the Invasive Species Council of BC. The IVMA is a recognized organization dedicated to the responsible practice of vegetation management throughout the province. Our membership represents diverse industries, including forestry, gas and electric utilities, railways and highways, and invasive plant management. The IVMA is the credit coordinator for the Ministry of Environment continuing education program for the recertification of pesticide applicators for the forestry, industrial vegetation, including noxious weeds, and aerial categories. You must be a member of the IVMA for us to track your credits. Information on this program, as well as how to become a member of the IVMA, can be found on our website at ivma.com. And we plan to enhance the opportunities for obtaining credits by holding these webinars. So far, we plan to hold 4 webinars per year. So as Steve mentioned, just to reiterate, this webinar will qualify for 1 credit in BC and 1 credit in Alberta. You must provide us with your pesticide applicator certificate number when you registered for this webinar. And if you live in Alberta, we also need your date of birth. You must stay for the entire presentation, and we do keep track of your attendance. You must answer the quiz at the end. You do not need to pass the quiz, you just need to answer it in order to obtain your credit. So at this point, I am very pleased to introduce our webinar speaker, Danielle Souliard. Danielle is the Manager of Chemistry, Science and Regulatory Affairs at CropLife Canada. This is the trade association that represents the Canadian manufacturers, developers, and distributors of pest control products and plants with novel traits. Danielle joined CropLife Canada in 2017 and is responsible for advancing science and risk-based legislation and regulation relating to the registration, use, and safe use and sale of pesticides in Canada. Danielle holds a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Carleton University in Ottawa and a Master's of Science degree in Environment Science from the University of Ottawa. So welcome, Danielle.
Thank you, Gwen and Stephen. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen now. I think you should see the full slides. Someone please let me know if you don't. So thanks for having me here today. As mentioned, my name is Danielle Soulard. I'm the manager of chemistry with CropLife Canada. I'm based in Ottawa, Ontario, so speaking to you from Ottawa today. And I did just want to kind of have a short apology at the beginning. There is some construction outside that just started, so if you hear some loud noises, I apologize for that. So we'll go ahead and get started. So as mentioned, some of you on the call may be familiar with CropLife, but for those who are not, we are the Canadian, we do represent the Canadian developers, manufacturers, and distributors of pest control products and modern plant breeding products. So our membership is here on the slide in front of you. And what I plan to go over today is the process of getting a pesticide to market. So we call it from lab to label. So I'll go over a little bit of the definition of pesticide, the regulation of pesticide in Canada, how a product is researched and developed, PMRA's evaluation and review, the label, reevaluation process, and touch on some industry stewardship programs, and also a short discussion about what's going on currently at PMRA. So firstly, what are pesticides? I'm sure you all are familiar since you are, this seems to be something that involves you in your line of work, of course, but obviously pesticides is an umbrella term. There's lots of different varieties of categories of pest control products. They are designed to address a specific pest problem, and they're categorized based on how they're used. So the ones that you're probably familiar with, this includes herbicides that control weeds or unwanted plants, fungicides, they control plant diseases, rots, mildews caused by things such as fungus and bacteria. Insecticides control potentially damaging or harmful insects, including mosquitoes and ticks in public health for public health reasons. Rodenticides, they control rodents, mice, and rats. And also there's a category known as antimicrobials or sanitizers, which kill microorganisms, also such as bacteria like fungicides, but this also includes viruses. So who uses pesticides? As you're likely familiar with, pesticides are used to maintain a large variety of areas and for different reasons. They are used by farmers, and a lot of the work that CropLife Canada does is focused on the agriculture sector. And this includes farmers who farm organically as well. But farming is by no means the only use of pesticides, the only sector that uses pesticides. You also see the use in forestry, gardening, homeowners, think ant control, also golf courses, power companies, roads and rail crews, and for maintaining sports fields. So for some of you, perhaps weeds and invasive plants are the first pests that come to mind when you think of a pest that needs to be controlled. Not only do weeds and invasive vegetation need to be managed in rights of ways and other corridors, but farmers are also very concerned about weeds as they do directly compete with crops and reduce crop yields. So just some examples of some common weeds in Canada, dandelions. They're often thought of just a lawn pest, but they're also a fierce competitor to field crops on farms. Wild oats, they're a very common issue in Western Canada. They compete with crops such as barley, canola, and wheat. Lamb's quarters, it's widespread throughout Canada, and thistle and water hemp are just some other examples. Insects are another common category of pests. Not only are insects challenging in terms of direct damage to crops, but insects pose challenges even after the crop is harvested, and they still affect a crop even when it's in storage. A big reason for this is that insects can transmit diseases. So any of this insect damage and introduction of disease can make products that are going to market inedible, and ultimately they do result in a lot of food waste. So some examples of insects here that you probably have heard of are bed bugs, fruit flies, armyworm. Armyworm feeds on weedy grasses, but also important crops like hay, barley, wheat, and oats. The potato beetle is a major pest of potato in Canada, and it is a large concern for potato growers. Corn earworm. It's a major pest of sweet and field corn. The corn becomes unsellable when there is an infestation of corn earworm because of direct damage, and also a fungus that is associated with the insect, and also grubs as a common lawn pest. Finally, the last topic, I guess, category I will just talk about of pests that need to be controlled are diseases. On crops, disease can set in really quickly and cause significant damage. Diseases are unpredictable, and they often do depend on weather conditions. And if not caught and controlled early, disease can wipe out an entire crop in a short amount of time, again, leading to a lot of losses, including losses of food waste. Some examples that are here are apple scab. Apple scab is the #1 fungal disease of apples in Canada. It attacks both the tree and the fruit, and it makes the apple completely unsellable. Potato blight is another one. It's the best known pathogen of potatoes. It's what led to the Irish potato famine that you may have heard of. And fusarium in wheat is one that's often discussed. It's a very serious problem as it produces a mycotoxin, which renders the wheat inedible if it's at too high of a level. So these diseases can all be controlled with appropriate antifungals or fungicides at the right time. So when it comes to food production, pesticides are an important toolbox that farmers have. And without pesticides, we estimate that you would lose on average about 40% of crops, which would have a significant effect on Canadians at the grocery store. So now on to how these products are regulated. So pesticides are regulated by Health Canada at the federal level. And the agency is the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, or the abbreviation that I'll use is PMRA. Provinces and territories are also involved in the ensuring pesticide use is safe and acceptable, such as issuing pesticide use permits, regulating the transportation, sale, storage, disposal. Provinces also regulate training and certification and licensing of applicators and vendors, and provinces are often involved related to any incidents such as any spills or accidents. Some provinces and municipalities have chosen to go beyond Health Canada and enact their own laws and sometimes restrictions in their jurisdictions that restrict pesticide use. For example, we sometimes see this happening in urban settings. So these are often bylaws, and these bylaw level restrictions that we see come out at the provincial and municipal levels aren't based on a science assessment like what we see at the federal level, as these jurisdictions don't actually have the scientific capacity to do the same type of review that PMRA does. But rather, these type of restrictions are often based on political pressure in their jurisdiction by their constituents, and they're often based on the particular government that holds power at the time. So it is just interesting to note that. So PMRA's responsibilities. So PMRA is a branch of Health Canada. They are the agency that administers the Pest Control Products Act on behalf of the Minister of Health. And the primary mandate of the minister under this piece of legislation is to prevent unacceptable risks to people and the environment from the use of pest control products. The other roles that PMRA has is to ensure that any pesticide residues on food and animal feed are safe. PMRA ensures that users have information such as a clear label to allow for proper use. PMRA also bases their decisions and ensures that decisions reflect the best science available, and they make policy judgments based on this. And another one of their goals in the preamble of the legislation is to support sustainable pest management. The Pest Control Products Act is the main piece of legislation that the PMRA enacts, but it is also supported by other pieces that are the pest control products regulations and other incident reporting regulations and various other more minor regulations under the Act. So now getting to how these products are approved and regulated. So I'd like to walk you through in the next couple of slides the work that is done before a pesticide can be used in Canada. This type of work is called research and development, or R&D. So the overall process of identifying a chemical, generating data, and having it reviewed takes on average 11 years, and there is an approximately $400 million investment to get an active ingredient through to registration. In the end, only a handful of chemicals make it that far. There's about 1 in 160,000 products or potential active ingredients that make it into an end-use product. And in this graphic, you can just see a handful of the types of studies needed during the R&D process. And I'm going to walk through some of those study requirements in the next couple of slides. So developing a new pesticide starts with screening in the lab, where thousands of chemicals are screened to find a new solution to an emerging or specific pest problem. Shortlisted chemicals are screened to ensure that they work against the intended pest, the problem that was identified, and they're also screened for potential negative effects on non-target plants and animals. The phase after screening is research. In this phase, chemicals are assessed and tested in great detail to determine the potential to cause adverse effects in humans, animals, or in the environment. Companies planning on registering a product in Canada do this phase by completing over 200 different tests that the PMRA mandates be completed to ensure that final products do not pose health or environmental concerns. The tests that are completed can fall into the categories of chemistry tests, human health tests, environment tests, and value tests. So the first type of study that's conducted that I'll talk about is chemistry studies. So chemistry data is pretty much exactly what you would think when you think chemistry data. It's really technical data that provides a comprehensive characterization of the actual chemistry formulation of an active ingredient. So specifically, PMRA needs to understand the composition of the product, the chemical structure. They need to understand the manufacturing and formulating process, where and how is it made. There is a huge focus on chemical impurities. So in the creation of any chemical, no matter what it is, there will be small levels of impurities introduced throughout the manufacturing process. And it's mandatory when creating a chemical and getting it registered that these are identified and that their formation is discussed. There is a need to understand other characteristics of the chemical, such as solubility and stability. There is also an exploration of metabolites, what the products change into. And finally, companies must confirm with PMRA and demonstrate all of the different analytical methods for all of the above. And PMRA has a number of chemists on hand who review and assess this data. Next, we have health studies. So health studies consider 4 different angles. How toxic is the product, and what are the characteristics and hazards that make it toxic to people or animals? So this angle is explored. The second angle is, what are the ways that someone could come into contact with the product, which is what we often talk as exposure. How could you be exposed to this product? Thirdly, there's a discussion about risk. So this takes into consideration the first 2 points, which is toxicity or the level of hazard and exposure. So both short-term and long-term risks of products are examined. And the way you can think about risk is that even a very toxic product can be low risk if there's no exposure. And the reverse is equally true. For example, I'll use an example that's sometimes used. Water. Water is a non-toxic substance. However, it can be a high risk if too much is consumed. So finally, how to manage risk is considered under the health studies. So risks can all be mitigated in different ways, and perhaps that's by decreasing exposure. So what's explored here is specific label directions that can be used to decrease exposure by, for example, limiting the amount of product used, making sure that personal protective equipment has to be used, not re-entering a sprayed area for a certain amount of time, etc. So just a little bit more about this kind of risk triangle that I'm describing. Assessing the risk of pesticides is the fundamental purpose of PMRA's review. So risk can be thought of using a simple equation, which is risk equals hazard times exposure. So the equation shows that risk is a product of both hazard. So on the previous slide, we were talking about this in terms of toxicity, hazard, and exposure. So for instance, coming into contact with a substance. So as either the hazard or exposure changes, so does the level of risk. And a third consideration when considering the risk is vulnerable populations at the individual level. So when PMRA is doing this calculation, there is a consideration of vulnerable populations such as children and the elderly, pregnant individuals, to understand how their different unique characteristics change the level of risk. And there's a third circle here on this diagram that represents the susceptibility of different individuals to different levels of risk. Another way to explain the risk and exposure relationship is an analogy using a hammer. So let's just say that there's a hammer. A hammer is a hazard to your thumb, but the risk of the hammer is hurting you is low if it's just lying on a table. But when you start to actually use the hammer close to your hand, you're increasing your exposure, and therefore the hammer poses a greater risk. So the link back to pesticides is that pesticides have labels that must be followed. So say there's a highly toxic product, but if it's used according to label directions, which minimize your exposure through the use of things like PPE or restrictions, the overall risk is mitigated. Oh, I think it's just lagging behind. Sorry, just one moment. There we go. So another concept that's considered under the health studies, in addition to the risk discussion we were just having, is maximum residue limits. So maximum residue limits, or MRLs, are the maximum amount of pesticide residue that is legally permitted to remain on food sold in Canada. MRLs are important, very important, to ensure that pesticides are used properly and so that Canadians have access to a safe food supply. In Canada, an agency called the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is responsible for testing pesticide residues on food. They do this annually throughout the year, and they release a report annually. They consistently find that 98% of fruit and vegetables in Canada comply with Health Canada's standards for pesticide residues. So 98 comply with standards. Those that were not compliant, so that small 2%, were evaluated to ensure that there was no risk. There was not a recall. CFIA has not done a recall based on their reports that I know of. And what's notable is that within this 98% compliance, most products had no residues detected whatsoever. So the MRL system is being proven to be working, which is great. And what's notable when it comes to pesticide residues is that there is a significant safety factor built into the level that PMRA sets. And that level of exposure is at least 100 times lower than what PMRA sets as acceptable. And I'll talk about a little bit about that on the next slide. So this is probably my most technical slide. So MRLs are set on a figure called the ADI, or the acceptable daily intake. So the ADI is calculated based on the amount of residue that could exist on a food when the product is used according to the label. The ADI considers all possible exposure and intake of this residue from all sources in your diet, including drinking water. So the ADI is set at a level that is 100 times higher, often called a margin of safety, than levels that you could observe any adverse effect at, which is called here the green bar, the no observed effect level, or NOEL, sometimes people call it. So in instances that MRLs were ever exceeded, while this would be considered a compliance violation for sure, and oftentimes this causes some trade disruptions, it does not automatically imply that there's a health risk because of these built-in safety factors. So on the right-hand side here, I've just included some screenshots from a website called safefruitandveggies.com. It's a website where you can calculate how many fruit and vegetables you would have to consume in a day to be potentially impacted by pesticide residues. Just two examples here that I pulled out. For example, a woman could consume 850 servings of apples a day without any effects expected from the residues, and a man could consume 184 servings of spinach. And the same magnitude is true for other food items. It's a fun little calculator if you want to go check it out. So moving on away from health studies, another category of testing is environmental. So considering the environment, tests are conducted to identify possible effects on mammals, birds, fish, insects, and other plants that are not intended to be the target of a pesticide. Tests are also done to consider and determine what happens to the chemical in the environment. For example, these lab and field-based tests explore persistence. How long does a product remain in the environment and on crops? Mobility. Can a chemical break down? What does it break down into? And how do its breakdown products move? And dissipation. How product breaks down in soil and water. And finally, in Canada, it's not enough to demonstrate that a product meets all of the different safety standards in the studies just discussed. Studies and information are also required to show that the product works and it has value. So these are called value studies, but they're also known as efficacy studies. So value tests are completed to ensure that products have merit and value, products do what they intend to do, and observe how the products perform on a variety of different pests in different conditions. And data from these tests help PMRA determine how a product should be applied when it comes to the label. So after 11 years of R&D, all of this information is packaged together and submitted to PMRA. So the PMRA assesses all of the information that was submitted. They assess all of the data and information to ensure that it meets the government requirements and standards for human health and the environment. In addition, during PMRA's review, it's not uncommon for PMRA to ask the company or the registrant. The registrant isn't always a company. Sometimes it's a province. Provinces can be registrants too. They sometimes ask for the registrant to provide more data to help them understand their review. And in the end, PMRA only registers products if they have sufficient scientific data to convince PMRA evaluators that the product works and can be used safely. So to put this into a more visual context of what PMRA does during their review, firstly, PMRA looks at toxicity and hazards. They identify exposure. They characterize the magnitude of risk. They explore options that could be set to mitigate risks, and they select a risk mitigation strategy to reduce or eliminate risk to human health or the environment under proper label use. And all of this comes together to make the regulatory decision. So at the end of a review, if a product is approved by PMRA, an official label with product use conditions is established. And when we say label, we mean two things generally. There is a label that is literally attached to the product jug that you may have, but this is often, there's also a label that is accessed on the PMRA website or sometimes sent as a link. It's a multi-page document. Labels are large documents, and these can all be accessed officially through PMRA's website. The label is considered a legal document that specifies the correct use of a product, and the label is required to include specific information that PMRA needs on the label. And that includes information such as the name and concentration of an active ingredient, detailed instructions for use, protective clothing requirements, product storage and other container disposal informations, time limits on re-entry to treated areas and pre-harvest intervals, environmental precautions or warnings, and any other information that is deemed necessary to enable users to use the product. And once the PMRA finishes their detailed review and their risk assessment, they publish a proposed decision on their website. Anyone can comment on the proposed decision and review the scientific information during this public comment period. After the public comment period, which is usually 90 days, PMRA then considers all relevant information and comments before a final decision is made. A registration decision is only made if the PMRA concludes that there is sufficient scientific evidence to show that the product does not pose what they call an unacceptable risk to human health or the environment, and that it also serves a useful purpose. So once approved, a product's review does not stop there. To ensure that older products that no longer meet modern standards are removed from the Canadian market and that use instructions on product labels are updated, the Pest Control Products Act requires that all products be reevaluated at least every 15 years, sometimes more, depending on data that arises. So during a reevaluation, PMRA relooks at all the data they had on hand, and they identify what new information is needed to make products meet their modern standards. So they look at new scientific data. They look at all information that's submitted through the incident reporting system. They look at research that's been done since the product was last registered, and they consider decisions from other regulatory agencies around the world to ensure that products being used in Canada continue to meet their standards. A special review is another form of post-market review that can occur at any time. And this can occur if new data or information shows that there is a risk that PMRA needs to evaluate again, or perhaps for the first time, if it wasn't considered in their previous review. So depending on a reevaluation and special review, PMRA may retain the registration with no changes, but that's not very common. Often we see amended labels to improve safety in some manner. Sometimes we see maximum residue limits be modified. Sometimes there's conditions on use while new data is generated, or sometimes products are just phased out and canceled altogether. And so now I'll just talk a little bit about pesticide life cycle stewardship. So after registration, CropLife Canada members, they have many stewardship programs in place to complement the existing laws and regulations for managing pesticides throughout their life cycle. And some of these include disposal. Disposal, we have a sister organization called Clean Farms that manages disposal end. There are standards for manufacturing, storage, and distribution. There's also different offerings of training and certification available, and there are materials available in the integrated pest management and responsible use space. And many of these programs are supported by standards that get audited and sites that get audited as well. So on Clean Farms manages the tail end of the product life cycle, as I mentioned. They are responsible for collecting and recycling empty containers, as well as unwanted or unneeded pesticides. So that could happen in the case that there is a reevaluation decision that cancels a product and someone has some leftover on their farm. Clean Farms will help dispose of that. They have also expanded to collect seed bags, as this was a common agriculture waste that didn't really have a home, I guess, for disposal. So Clean Farms does recycling, unwanted or obsolete products, and seed bags. And so since this program started 30 years ago, more than 126 million empty containers were collected, and 32 million kilograms of obsolete product had been collected from farms across Canada. They've also collected 1.3 million kilograms of empty seed bags. So what's really important here is that these containers don't end up in municipal landfill sites, but they are recycled back into agriculture plastics that are used in some cases, again, to house pesticides. Another initiative that the industry has worked on, and this is one that's collaboratively with growers and also academic researchers, is something called Manage Resistance Now. So think antibiotic resistance, how there's concern about antibiotic resistance developing. That concern also exists with pesticides to pests, because pests, just like bacteria, they have the natural ability to evade threats. So there is definitely a concern in the industry that certain products could become, pests could become resistant to certain products. And so this effort, again, in unison with growers and researchers, is developed to help minimize the development of pesticide resistance in Canada. It is the first of its kind in Canada. It launched in 2018, and it aims to provide a more holistic approach to managing weed, insect, and disease resistance. There's a lot of focus on IPM, cultural, mechanical, biological, and chemical best practices to help manage resistance. So on the website, manageResistanceNow.ca, you'll find a variety of communication tools and case studies that provide easily digestible information for growers, crop advisors, researchers, and it's intended to promote strategies that will help reduce pesticide resistance. Another initiative that's worth mentioning is that we also spearhead a set of standards for pesticide use in protected agriculture systems. So this includes greenhouses and other specialized covered structures. So this is an industry-led and value chain supported approach that's being undertaken to ensure that pesticide use in greenhouses stays in greenhouses and not in the effluent. So standards include documenting product use and storage, as well as an irrigation system test to ensure that there's no leaks. And this is done by engineers using a specific dye test. And so effective next year, January 2023, only greenhouse producers who have successfully completed an audit for the standards will be eligible to buy products from our member companies. Last slide on standards, we also administer the Agriculture Warehousing Standards Association, or AWSA. AWSA imposes mandatory standards for incorporating environmental health and safety requirements in greenhouses. This organization also manages a set of standards for the treatment of seed, which is mandatory for all facilities in Canada that process corn, canola, and soybean seeds and treat them with pesticides. And similar to the greenhouse standards, CropLife Canada companies will not ship product to uncertified warehouses or uncertified seed treaters. So now just wrapping up with a little bit about what's going on at PMRA. So there was a big announcement last year that PMRA is looking at something called their transformation agenda. So they currently have a lot going on, and I could give you an entire presentation on this alone, but I've limited myself to one slide. So this is my last slide. PMRA right now is working on a number of initiatives, again, called the transformation agenda. The agenda has 3 pillars, as you see on your screen. This is a slide borrowed from a PMRA presentation. The pillars are further strengthening human health and environmental protection through modernized business processes governing pesticide reviews. It's a really long title to just mean they're looking at how their reevaluation system works. The second pillar is improve transparency to increase understanding and enable meaningful public participation in the regulatory process. And the third pillar is increase use of real-world data and independent advice to better inform regulatory decision-making. So this agenda started last year, and really happy to share that it started with a much needed funding allocation to the PMRA and other related federal pest control programs for a total of $50 million. So this was something that the entire value chain had been advocating for some time, that PMRA needs more funding. So they did receive some funding. And many of the components that are captured under these pillars are not new, but we're extremely pleased that they will be funded. So the first pillar about modernizing their business processes, as I mentioned earlier, this is about the reevaluation cycle that considers the reevaluation of all pesticides on a 15-year cycle. PMRA was falling behind on this work because their workload is so high. And so this pillar is going to look at new and fresh ideas to help enable PMRA to complete the reviews in a timely manner. And this work has been ongoing to review this system since 2018. So the funding is a really welcome, I guess, development to help them be able to actually put some of their fresh ideas into practice and start piloting some things. Similarly, another component that's been in the works for many years now is related to the third pillar there in green. And this is a national pesticide water monitoring program. So currently this does not exist. Environment Canada does water monitoring, but there is no national standard program for water monitoring of pesticides in water. This is really important because PMRA needs water monitoring data to make sure that the labels are working appropriately and that mitigation measures are having the desired effects. Exploration and development of this program started in 2019. And this year, PMRA began to pilot their approach by taking some samples. And their goal is to have a more complete program running hopefully next year. They might pilot again next year, but we might see something more permanent next year. So that's really exciting. And the third pillar, the middle pillar, it's new. This is a new pillar for PMRA, the increased focus on how to make PMRA decisions and processes more transparent. Analysis is underway to see what this might look like, but really interesting file, and we're curious to see how it develops and what that looks like. So all of this, oh, there we go. So all of this has been underpinned by this blue box here. It was a targeted review of the Pest Control Products Act, which happened earlier this year. It closed in June 2022. So as I mentioned, there's a lot going on as it relates to PMRA. But these items on this screen they're on the periphery of what we'll call PMRA's core work. So the word that we're receiving is that none of this is currently impacting PMRA science reviews that we walked through earlier. Evaluators are still doing their thing, evaluating products according to the status quo. But this large project is something that is happening, and we anticipate hearing more in the coming months about the direction that it will go. And I think that brings me to the end. So I thank you. I know that's a lot of information. I think we have some time, and I can answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was a very excellent, detailed presentation. I'm going to open up the Q&A box and start with the first question. So if you have any, please add more in there. And as I mentioned earlier, if there's not enough time to address all the questions, we can send out the answers via email. If you see your question already being asked, just click the thumbs up button and bring it to the top. And also the quiz is now open, which you must complete to gain your continuing education credit. So click on the link in the chat in a web browser on your computer, or use your phone and scan the QR code on the screen. And again, if you're from Alberta, it will ask you for your date of birth. All right. We have one question here for you, Danielle. Are impacts to microbials evaluated during environmental studies?
Sorry, I muted myself. I think that might be microbes, like soil microbes. And yes, yeah, PMRA considers that during their environmental assessment.
Great.
And I guess if that's not your question, there's also a class of products called microbials. And PMRA definitely assesses microbials. They're considered a pesticide too. So not sure what direction that was going, but hopefully that answered one of them.
Thank you. We have another one about the Clean Farms program. Do they accept containers and products from non-farm or agriculture sources?
At this time, I don't believe so. I don't believe so. Sorry, I don't think so. That said, if that's something that you would like to discuss with Clean Farms, I can definitely give you their contact information. I think their purpose is to ensure that obsolete pesticides are managed. And so I'm not sure exactly where they see that starting and ending. So I apologize, I can't really provide a fulsome answer, but happy to provide you with a link to Clean Farms or a contact.
Great, thank you. I had one question for you, actually. Is there any pests that are being prioritized moving forward and for pesticide development?
Any pests? Unfortunately, I don't have that at the tip of my fingers. I'm more on like the regulatory side. Sorry, I'm not super current with the R&D, like what's coming down the pipeline. So I'm sorry, I don't have that.
No problem. Thank you. We have another question about the water monitoring and what type of water monitoring will be targeted in the National Water Monitoring Plan.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think I could answer it in a couple of ways. So surface water, for sure. Fresh water, for sure. They're not looking at anything marine based, groundwater as well. But when we talk about surface water, PMRA recognizes the difference between surface water in Eastern Canada and surface water in Western Canada. So in Eastern Canada, there is going to be a really high, I guess, level of detail given to flowing water systems, so rivers, because that's a big bulk of the watersheds are river-based. Now, in Western Canada, I understand it is more wetland-based when we start looking at Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. So PMRA is doing both flowing systems and wetland systems.
Excellent. And we received a really interesting follow-up question. Will this water monitoring data be published and available to the public?
Yes, it should be. So they're still really early days. Really early days. So they were piloting approaches this summer. I understand to get their analytical methods and their sampling protocol kind of understood. They're also working with Environment Canada. It is going to be Environment Canada and provincial Ministry of Environment staff who are doing the actual water collecting. So there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen before a program like this can get off the ground. So they're piloting, they're going to be checking some samples at labs to make sure that their kind of assessment methods are working. And then I know that a huge piece of this is going to be how to get this data that is going to be government owned, how to get it available. And I know that their intent is to make it publicly available, probably first through existing portals that the federal government has. I think Environment Canada has a whole slew of different portals that fall under their open science. Like I know you can go look at different data that's collected by Environment Canada. I think PMRA will first upload their data when they have some there. But I think the intent is to have their own kind of standalone portal. They want to have something that they manage and use themselves. So we'll see. I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like yet. I think it's really important that it's publicly available though. And as it's government owned data, I think that's their intent.
Great, thank you. We have one. Do you think there will be an increase in environmental studies on pesticide impacts during reevaluation, considering the amount of public interest and concern that seems to be growing? And what details might be considered in greater detail?
So I think that's an interesting question. Whether there will be an increase in environmental studies. So PMRA has what they call their DACO tables. So it's their data code tables that has hundreds of studies that must be submitted at the time when a product is being registered. I will happily give you that link and you can take a look at the different types of studies that are explored there. It was way more than I could have gotten into in my presentation. In terms of the question, will there be an increase in environmental studies? I'd be curious to know what you're thinking, like what might not be already submitted. Maybe if so, PMRA is always open to more data. I think that that's something that we know. So if there ever is I would say a deficiency or an area that is emerging, like an area of emerging science, PMRA often asks for those studies to be submitted. I don't know if there's any work going on at PMRA to actually add studies to their current DACO tables because it's quite extensive already. So to that, I don't really have a great answer. I do know that the environmental studies at PMRA are considered by their directorate that's called EAD, or the Environmental Assessment Directorate. It's a huge department, a lot of scientists, most of them are environmental scientists. So I think that they do try to stay on top of emerging science. But I'm not sure if they're looking at expanding the subset of studies that they're asking for at this time.
Great, thank you. We do have another question related to that, specifically about long-term studies for approving the use of a chemical. And could you speak to kind of the longest term studies that are being used to assess different pesticides?
Yeah, so I think again, this speaks to government data requirements. So there are definitely long-term studies that are being done on the periphery related to farm workers. Like I see you mentioned farm workers. There are some long-term farm worker studies conducted. These are mostly epidemiology studies, and to my knowledge, they're not submitted to the government because they're not required. That said, the reason that studies have the timelines that they do when you're looking at a human toxicology study is because of the models that are used. So the models that are used in a human tox study are often rats, mice, rabbits. And when you use those models in toxicology testing, it is not, they are able to extrapolate that to a lifespan of a larger celled organism. So it's not 100% a great answer, but I will just say that there are a number of different initiatives. I can send you a link to a couple. There was a couple, I forget the name of them off the top of my head, long-term farm-based studies looking at different things like cancer incidence rates, and happy to pass on that link.
Thank you. We also got a helpful comment from a previous question saying clean farms will collect triple rinsed pesticide containers from industrial vegetation management operators.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm not a clean farms expert, so thank you very much. Yeah.
We got another good question. Can you speak to how the registration process in Canada compares to the US? There seems to be a lot more chemistry options available in the United States.
Yeah, so I don't know specifics on chemistry options available, but definitely hear you. That's something that I hear sometimes when talking to users. The registration process in the US are very, very similar in terms of data requirements. There are some nuances that make the two different. I would say that type of thing comes down to a business decision, and that's an area that I'm not well versed on. So I'm sorry about that. I don't really have a great question, but there could be different reasons for registering things in one country versus not another, related to maybe the extent of use, the use pattern. It often comes down to an individual company business decision, and so don't really have a great answer for you there.
Thank you. We also are interested in how we compare to Europe. We seem to lag behind Europe for considering and protecting the environment and public health, and they seem to ban certain chemicals years ahead of Canada.
Yeah, so Europe is an interesting, they have an interesting regulatory system. So the way that Europe operates often at the EFSA level, and that's the European Food Safety Authority, is that they use a hazard-based approach, whereas in Canada we have a risk-based approach. And what that means is that the existence of a hazard often triggers a set of criteria in Europe. So the fact that something is toxic on this scale, Europe has cutoff criteria, whereas Canada operates and PMRA operates, they use what they call a risk-based system. So they look at the risk on a continuum and they set mitigation measures to mitigate those risks. And that's why US EPA is the same as Canada, a risk-based system. That's why you often see Europe having different outcomes, is that their regulatory system is based on a different set of principles. And I agree. Yeah, we do often see some different decisions coming out of Europe.
Thank you. And how about what kind of consultations will PMRA do in developing their transformational agenda?
Great question. So I know that they kicked this all off. It happened last August. That was when the announcement came out that they were going to do a looking at their different pillars of their programs. In March of 2022, so this year, they released a document called a Targeted Review of the Pest Control Products Act. This was originally open for 30 days, and it was a massive consultation document. So a big group of stakeholders secured a 60-day extension. So I think that closed in June of 2022. So that was their first bit of consultation. Now, every time that PMRA comes out with something that's going to be a policy change, a regulatory change, or a legislative change, that will need to be consulted on. But what I know that the government is doing right now is that they are considering everything that they heard in this first consultation. So in the number of weeks, I anticipate before Christmas, there will be a what we heard report from PMRA, which is pretty standard when they do something large like this. They're going to issue a what we heard report. It'll be on their website. And I don't know if in that report we will see next steps on what they plan to do. So to answer your question, will PMRA consult? Yes, I think in certain cases they have to. When, I'm not sure, in addition to the one that they already did. And I see the clarification about the protected ag standards. Thanks so much. Again, this is handled by a separate person to me, our stewardship director. And yeah, so it's not this year, it's next. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And yeah, that was the last point in the Q&A box. So that seems to be the end of all the questions we have. So thanks again, Danielle, for sharing your expertise with us today. And thanks to you as well, Gwen. And on behalf of the ISCBC and the IVMA and all those that are listening, we'll be sending out a link to a short survey to all participants. We encourage you to please fill it out so we can get your feedback and ideas for future webinars. And if you're not already a member of IVMA or ISCBC, please visit the links in the chat to learn more. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.